Long before the Akatsuki became the infamous organization draped in black cloaks with red clouds, they were something far more fragile, far more human. To understand their story, we must travel back to a land drowned in endless boun, to a village that knew only sorrow. This was Amegakure, the village hidden in the rain, a place caught between great nations, a battlefield for wars it never started, a home to children who grew up watching soldiers march through their streets and hearing the cries of loss echo with every storm. Among those children were Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato. They were not born into comfort or stability. They were born into conflict, into hunger, into the constant fear of war that stripped away the innocence of their youth. They wandered through muddy roads, their stomachs empty, their eyes hollow, searching for scraps of food in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Their parents were gone, victims of the endless conflicts between the great shinobi nations, and all they had was each other. In those days, before they were known as anything more than orphans, they held one another close against the cold. It was in this state of desperation that they encountered two legendary shinobi, Jiraiya of the Sanin, and his comrades, Tsunade and Orochimaru. At the time, the three were traveling through the rain, remnants of Konoha's presence in the wars that consumed the land of rain. Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato approached them not as enemies, but as starving children, trembling yet determined, asking for guidance. Jiraiya, moved by their plight, chose to remain behind, at least for a time. His heart, which always held space for the suffering of others, would not let him walk away. So it was that these three orphans found their first taste of family again. Jiraiya became their teacher, their protector, and in some ways, their father. He taught them ninjutsu not for glory, but for survival. He showed them how to defend themselves in a world that had already taken so much. Nagato, who carried within him the Rinnegan, an eye of godlike power, began to understand the weight of his gift. Konan, steady and graceful, learned to weave paper into wings and weapons. Yahiko, bold and fiery, discovered the voice of a leader, one who could inspire even the most downtrodden to stand tall. Yet Jiraiya could not stay forever. The wars called him back, and though he left them with knowledge, the three were forced to face the storm alone once more. In that crucible of suffering, Yahiko took on the role of leader. He gathered others who had been displaced, others who had lost homes and families to the endless strife. From that gathering, the first vision of Akatsuki was born. But this Akatsuki was not the organization the world would come to fear. It was a movement for peace, a group of dreamers who believed they could end the suffering of the land of rain, who believed they could carve a future free from endless war. Their symbol, the red cloud upon their cloaks, was not meant to inspire fear, but remembrance. It represented the blood that had been across their homeland, rain that seemed forever tinged with crimson. It was both a mark of sorrow and a vow to prevent more needless bloodshed. Together, Yahiko, Nagato, Conan, and their growing circle of followers moved through the land of rain, protecting villagers, driving away soldiers, and standing as a symbol of hope in a place where hope had long seemed impossible. For a time, their dream flourished. The people looked to Akatsuki as saviors, protectors who stood against the tide of endless violence. But dreams often falter when they clash with the realities of power. The great nations did not care for peace in the rain. To them, a megacore was a tool, a battlefield, a pawn to be moved in greater games of war. And within the rain itself, a shadow loomed. Hanzo of the Salamander, the leader of Amagakure, a man feared across the shinobi world for his ruthless strength. At first, Yahiko sought alliance with Hanzo, believing that together they could bring stability to their home. But Hanzo was not a man of dreams. He was a man hardened by survival, by betrayal, by the knowledge that in this world, trust was often a weapon used against the naive. He saw in Akatsuki not partners, but threats, young idealists who could one day challenge his rule. And in the shifting sands of power, Danzo Shimura of Konoha's shadowy root organization whispered into Hanzo's ear, fanning the flames of fear. What followed would forever change the course of the Akatsuki's story. Hanzo set a trap, luring Yahiko and his companions into negotiations under the guise of peace. But instead of alliance, they were met with betrayal. Surrounded by enemies, forced into an impossible choice, Yahiko stood at the heart of it. Hanzo demanded Nagato kill him, forcing the boy with the Rinnegan to choose between loyalty to his friend or the survival of their people. Yahiko, seeing the truth, smiled one last time and threw himself onto Nagato's kunai. His blood spilled not as surrender, but as a final act of defiance, a choice to save his friend and the dream they had shared. In that moment, Nagato's heart shattered. The pain of Yahiko's death cracked open something deep within him, and from his anguish rose a storm unlike any the land of rain had ever seen. The Rinnegan's power surged, and the 6 paths of pain were born. Akatsuki's dream of peace did not die that day. It twisted. It hardened into something unrecognizable, reshaped by grief and fury. Under Nagato's leadership, guided by the name Pain, Akatsuki would no longer beg for peace. They would force it upon the world. And so, the red cloud that once stood for remembrance and hope became something darker. No longer a symbol of salvation, it became the mark of an organization that the world would soon fear. A reminder that even the noblest dreams, when broken by sorrow, can become nightmares. The organization that would one day come to be known as the Akatsuki did not always carry with it the shadow of infamy. In its earliest form, it was born not from malice, but from hope. Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato, 3 orphans of the Hidden Rain village, had witnessed firsthand the cruelty of the endless wars that tore their country apart. Their childhood was marked by hunger, fear, and loss. But instead of succumbing to despair, they dared to dream of peace. Yahiko, in particular, carried within him a fiery conviction that the cycle of violence could be broken. He believed that through unity and strength, they could carve out a better path, not just for themselves, but for their homeland. To him, the Akatsuki was not an organization of terror, but a banner of hope, a gathering of those who longed for a world without endless bloodshed. Together, the 3 friends built a movement that inspired others. Slowly, they began to attract followers, other war-weary shinobi, and common people who wished to see the ceaseless reigns of their village finally end. The Akatsuki's early days were filled with energy, with Yahiko at the center as its charismatic leader. He had a gift for rallying people, for speaking in words that ignited sparks of belief, even in those who had long since given up on hope. Konan was the quiet strength by his side, her origami-like paper, jutsu, not only a weapon, but a symbol of fragile beauty, surviving in the harshest conditions. And then there was Nagato, whose Rinnegan eyes had been awakened by tragedy, though at this stage he had yet to fully embrace the destiny they implied. For now, he was Yahiko's closest ally, supporting his dream with all the conviction he could muster. Together, the 3 formed the core of the Akatsuki, with their bond serving as the foundation upon which the group was built. In the war-torn land of rain, their message spread like wildfire. Ordinary citizens, desperate for peace, looked to them as protectors. Even shinobi, who had grown disillusioned with endless conflict, were drawn into their ranks. They began to gain strength, not only in numbers, but in influence, their presence becoming impossible to ignore. Soon, whispers of the Akatsuki began to drift beyond the borders of the rain, reaching the ears of powerful leaders in the great ninja villages. But while Yahiko's dream was noble, the reality of the world was harsh. For every step they took forward, opposition rose up to block their path. The greatest threat to them was not from distant nations, but from within their own land. The Hidden Rain was ruled by Hanzo the Salamander, a man once feared as one of the most powerful shinobi in existence. Hanzo was a figure of legend, his strength so great that he had once been considered invincible in battle. But by the time Yahiko's Akatsuki began to rise, Hanzo had grown suspicious, paranoid, and deeply protective of his authority. The Akatsuki's popularity posed a direct challenge to his rule, and in his eyes, Yahiko's dream was nothing more than rebellion. Hanzo, unwilling to share power or risk losing control, began to see the young group not as idealists, but as dangerous insurgents. This tension grew worse when outside forces became involved. The great villages had long used the rain as a battlefield for their wars, and one in particular, Konoha's Danzo Shimura, saw in Hanzo a tool to maintain his influence. Danzo whispered lies and manipulated fears, convincing Hanzo that the Akatsuki's rise was a threat that had to be crushed before it spread too far. Caught between his own paranoia and the manipulations of outsiders, Hanzo laid a trap. The betrayal came swiftly. Hanzo pretended to offer peace talks, summoning Yahiko and his followers under the guise of negotiation. But when the Akatsuki arrived, they found themselves surrounded, with Hanzo's forces vastly outnumbering them. Worse still, Konan was taken hostage, bound before their eyes as leverage. It was then that Hanzo delivered his cruel demand. For the Akatsuki to survive, Yahiko would have to die by Nagato's hand. Hanzo believed that by breaking their bond and forcing such an act of betrayal, the Akatsuki's dream would shatter. The moment was unbearable. Nagato, torn between his loyalty and the impossible choice, could only tremble under the weight of Hanzo's order. But Yahiko, ever the leader, refused to allow despair to claim them. With a final, resolute smile, he threw himself onto Nagato's kunai, sacrificing his life so that Nagato and Konan might live. His last words carried the weight of his dream, entrusting the future of the Akatsuki to his dearest friend. In that moment, Nagato's world collapsed. Yahiko's death marked the end of the Akatsuki as it had once been. What began as a movement of peace was drowned in blood and betrayal. But from that tragedy, a new, darker Akatsuki would emerge, shaped by Nagato's grief and rage. With the Rinnegan blazing and pain burning within his heart, Nagato unleashed his fury, summoning power so overwhelming that Hanzo's forces were crushed. The young man who had once followed Yahiko's dream of hope became consumed by the belief that peace could only be achieved through absolute control, through making the world understand pain itself. Thus, under Nagato's name, and with Konan still at his side, the Akatsuki was reborn. No longer merely a symbol of hope in a small, war-torn land, it began to grow into the shadowy organization that would one day shake the entire shinobi world. With Yahiko's sacrifice still heavy in their hearts, the Akatsuki shifted under Nagato's control. The warmth of Yahiko's charisma and his dream of hope was gone, replaced by something colder, more severe. Nagato, carrying the unbearable burden of his friend's death, no longer believed peace could be born from words alone. To him, Yahiko's end was proof that the world understood only force, only pain. If the cycle of hatred could not be broken by hope, then it would be shattered by fear. Peace would not be asked for, it would be imposed. Nagato's transformation was not only emotional, but also physical. The trauma of battle had left his body fragile and weakened, unable to move freely. To continue leading, he retreated into a hidden chamber within a megacore, the rain's towering and misty stronghold. There, using his Rinnegan, he developed the 6 paths of pain, a technique unlike anything the shinobi world had ever seen. By implanting chakra receivers into the corpses of fallen warriors, Nagato was able to control them as extensions of himself. Each of these bodies became a vessel for his will, together forming the 6 paths of pain. Through them, Nagato could walk, fight, and command, while his true body remained concealed, hidden away from danger. To the outside world, the man once known as Nagato no longer existed. In his place, there was only Pain, a godlike figure who spoke with absolute conviction. Where Yahiko had been the heart, Pain became the weapon. Konan, still loyal and bound by the love she carried for both Yahiko and Nagato, remained at his side, serving as his partner, his confidant, and the angel to his self-proclaimed godhood. Together, they remade the Akatsuki into something that reflected this new vision, an organization that would use power and terror to enforce peace across nations. But Pain and Konan knew they could not carry out this grand design alone. For their plan to succeed, they would need strength far beyond what their small group had once possessed. Slowly, methodically, the Akatsuki began to seek out others. Rogue shinobi, outcasts, and killers whose talents and power made them both feared and hunted. Each member brought with them a story of betrayal, ambition, or tragedy. And together, they became the new face of the Akatsuki. The first to join were those drawn to power and survival above all else. Among them was Itachi Uchiha, the prodigy of Konoha's most gifted clan. Branded a traitor for slaughtering his family, Itachi entered the Akatsuki with a calm, unreadable demeanor. His true motives, however, were buried deep, hidden even from his comrades. To the organization, he was simply a cold and capable weapon, a shinobi whose Sharingan could end battles in an instant. Alongside him came Kizame Hoshigaki, the monster of the hidden mist, wielding the living blade Samahada. Known for his brutal strength and shark-like appearance, Kisame was a warrior who relished in combat, making him a perfect partner for Itachi. Others soon followed. Deidara, the explosive artist from Iwagakure, brought with him a love of destruction and a philosophy that clashed with nearly everyone else. His clay bombs turned the battlefield into his canvas, each explosion a fleeting masterpiece. Sasori of the Red Sand, master puppeteer of Sunagakure, joined as well. His obsession with eternal art embodied in his transformation into a living puppet. Together, Deidara and Sasori formed a deadly pair, their missions carried out with ruthless precision. The Akatsuki's roster continued to grow. Heidan, the immortal zealot of Joshin, whose very existence mocked the fragility of life, was paired with Kakuzu, a mercenary obsessed with wealth who had lived for over a century by stitching together the hearts of his victims. Their dynamic was strange, chaotic, and filled with bickering, yet effective. Zetsu, a creature born not from human origins, but from something far older and darker, lurked at the edges of the organization, serving as both scout and spy. And finally, there was Hobie, a figure who at first presented himself as clumsy, foolish, and harmless, hiding behind a swirling orange mask. His true identity and intentions remained obscured, but his presence in the Akatsuki would prove more significant than anyone realized. With each new recruit, the Akatsuki's strength grew, and so did their ambitions. What had begun as a movement of peace in the rain had now become an assembly of the most dangerous shinobi in the world, united under Pain's vision. Their black cloaks, patterned with red clouds, became a symbol of dread, instantly recognized across the shinobi nations. Wherever the Akatsuki went, whispers of death and destruction followed. Still, their plan was far greater than mere violence. Pain's strategy extended beyond fear. It centered on the tailed beasts, the living weapons of mass destruction scattered across the ninja world. To the Akatsuki, these creatures were the key to enforcing peace. By collecting all 9, they could create a weapon so overwhelming that no nation would ever dare rise against another again. To accomplish this, the organization began to move in secret, sending pairs of its members on missions to capture the Jinchuriki, the humans who bore these beasts within them. One by one, the Akatsuki began their hunt. Some missions were swift and decisive, with the immense power of their pairs overwhelming isolated targets. Others were prolonged struggles, testing the limits of both their cunning and their cruelty. Each capture brought them closer to their goal, their influence spreading like a storm cloud over the entire world. The Akatsuki were no longer confined to the rain. They were everywhere, watching, waiting, and striking. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound strength, subtle fractures remained. Each member of the Akatsuki had their own motives, their own reasons for joining. For some, it was survival. For others, power. For a few, it was simply the opportunity to indulge in destruction. Only Nagato and Konan remained steadfast in their devotion to the dream that had once belonged to Yahiko, though it had now been twisted into something darker. For Nagato, the Akatsuki was no longer a dream of hope, but a weapon of fear, a necessary evolution in a world too broken to understand kindness. And so, the Akatsuki moved deeper into the shadows of history, no longer a small group of orphans struggling for survival, but a storm that threatened to consume the world. The Akatsuki's purpose sharpened into something unmistakable once they began the hunt for the tailed beasts. No longer were they content to remain a whisper in the dark, or a rumor traded between frightened shinobi. Now they moved openly, their black cloaks with red clouds fluttering in the wind as warnings of inevitable destruction. Wherever 2 members appeared together, the people knew someone would not survive, and a beast would soon be taken. The first of their great captures came with the weaker hosts, those less defended than the stronger Jinchuriki tied to the great villages. Their strikes were precise and ruthless. Deidara and Sasori, with their endless debates on art, nonetheless functioned as a merciless pair. It was they who targeted the host of the One-Tail, Gaara of the Sand, who had grown into a fearsome protector of Sunagakure. Gaara's power was immense, his control of sand nearly unmatched, but against the combined force of the Akatsuki, even he could not stand forever. The battle left his people shaken, their Kazekage stolen away like a child ripped from his home. When the Akatsuki sealed Shukaku into the demonic statue, it was not only a loss for the sand, it was the beginning of a storm felt across every hidden village. Their methods were as cruel as they were effective. The captured Jinchuriki were brought to hidden chambers, where the members gathered in projection around the great, monstrous form of the demonic statue of the outer path. There, they performed the long, grueling ritual to extract the beast, chanting in unison as the chakra was torn from the host's body. It was a process that ended only in death for the one who carried the beast. With each ritual, another red ring of power encircled the statue, marking the Akatsuki's progress toward their goal. The world began to tremble under their movements. Nations that had once thought themselves strong realized how vulnerable they truly were. A single pair from the Akatsuki could infiltrate even the most fortified village and emerge victorious. Stories spread of Kisame cutting down entire squadrons with his blade that devoured chakra like water. Rumors told of Haiden laughing through battle wounds that would have killed any other man, swinging his scythe with manic devotion to his god. Kakuzu, with his stitched body and hunger for wealth, tore hearts from his enemies, sewing them into himself as trophies and tools to extend his unnatural life. Each mission left behind only ruins and fear. But to Pain, this was justice. This was the world finally experiencing the suffering that Amegakure had known for so long. He saw every capture as a step toward peace. For once all 9 beasts were under his control, he believed nations would finally understand the futility of war. Through fear, the endless cycle of hatred would end. Yet, within the Akatsuki, not all shared this clarity of purpose. Desidera fought not for peace, but for the recognition of his art, seeing his explosions as fleeting masterpieces. Sasori sought to prove that his eternal puppetry surpassed the temporary beauty of life. Hidan cared for nothing beyond his twisted faith, dragging Kakuzu into constant arguments that often ended in blood. And Itachi, though feared for his betrayal of the Uchiha, carried a secret loyalty to Konoha, hidden deep beneath his calm and unshakable mask. This strange collection of motives created an organization both united and divided. To the outside world, they appeared unstoppable, a dark brotherhood moving in perfect sync. But within, cracks spread quietly through their foundation, each member holding back truths, ambitions, or desires that would one day pull them apart. Still, their power grew undeniable. With each successful mission, the demonic statue filled, and the Akatsuki's shadow stretched across the world. The red clouds on their cloaks became more than symbols. They were warnings. To see them was to know despair was coming. Entire villages began fortifying their defenses. Alliances were whispered among Cage, who had once distrusted each other, and yet none could agree on how to face this threat. The Akatsuki had no borders, no home that could be besieged, no flag except their own. They were everywhere and nowhere, moving like ghosts through the great nations. Meanwhile, Konan's presence remained a quiet but unshakable constant. With her origami jutsu, she scattered paper across battlefields and skies alike, a watchful angel of death. Unlike the others, her loyalty was not fractured by greed, pride, or religion. She served only Nagato, the boy she had once sheltered beneath her paper wings. Through every ritual, every mission, she stood at his side, a reminder of the dream they had once shared with Yahiko, a dream that now seemed unrecognizable, swallowed by blood and pain. And always, watching from behind his orange mask, was Toby. At first, he seemed an afterthought, a fool tolerated for his clumsy antics and strange humor. But slowly, he revealed glimpses of something else. In shadows, he spoke with Zetsu, his voice deeper, darker, and commanding. He hinted at knowledge of the tailed beasts older than anyone else possessed. Where Pain saw himself as a god, Toby played the role of something quieter and more patient, weaving threads that even Pain could not see. The hunt pressed onward. Each capture brought them closer to their goal, and each death added to their legend. Where once they had been orphans begging for peace in the rain, now they were executioners of the world's strongest weapons. And as the statue loomed larger in their hidden chamber, the question spread across every village. Could anyone stand against the Akatsuki? Or was this truly the beginning of a new era? One ruled not by nations, but by shadows, clothed in black and red. As the Akatsuki's conquests mounted, the balance of the shinobi world began to shatter. Their relentless pursuit of the tailed beasts was no longer a distant rumor, but a looming threat felt in every corner of every village. The great nations, who had spent generations at war with one another, suddenly found themselves united in fear of this shadow organization whose power no single army could match. When the two tails of the hidden cloud was captured by Haiden and Kakuzu, the shinobi world trembled again. Yugito Nai, the Jinchuriki of the beast, was powerful in her own right, feared for her mastery of fire and agility. Yet she was dragged down and sealed all the same, her death another symbol of the Akatsuki's inevitability. For the cloud, it was not just the loss of a weapon, but of a protector, a living symbol of their pride. When the cloud raged against her fate, they found only silence, for the Akatsuki had already moved on to their next prey. Kisame Hoshigaki, with his monstrous strength, brought devastation wherever he was sent. His blade, Samahada, feasted on chakra, leaving his victims powerless as he cut them down. Entire lakes and rivers turned crimson under his hand. Villages whispered that to meet Kisame was to meet death itself, and the Akatsuki took comfort in such legends. Fear was a tool, as valuable as any weapon. Meanwhile, Deidara's name spread like wildfire after his clash with Gaara, and later with other enemies who fell victim to his art. His explosions painted the sky, terrifying those who could do nothing but watch from below. Deidara's laughter, as his creations bloomed in fire and destruction haunted survivors, and to many, it felt as though the Akatsuki had unleashed an artist of apocalypse upon the world. To him, each mission was not just a duty, but a canvas, another opportunity to carve his philosophy of fleeting beauty into the earth itself. Itachi Uchiha and Kisame's movements were the most carefully observed, for Konoha had branded Itachi a criminal beyond redemption. Yet even those who hated him most could not help but feel uneasy at his presence in the Akatsuki. His calm, measured demeanor set him apart from his chaotic comrades. He spoke little, killed swiftly, and rarely lingered on the battlefield. To many, he seemed to embody the Akatsuki's core, the silent terror that one could not resist, the shadow that slipped through walls and ended lives without hesitation. The sealing of the beasts continued. Each ritual drained Nagato further, his emaciated body tethered by chakra rods, barely sustained by his power. Yet through his pain avatars, he appeared unstoppable, declaring himself a god and herald of true peace. To those who followed him, his vision was absolute, a world free from war, forged through universal suffering. The villages might resist, but once the Akatsuki controlled every beast, none would dare challenge them. But while the world focused on pain and his growing godhood, another figure stirred in the darkness. Toby, once dismissed as a fool, began to peel away his playful mask and step forward with a new authority. His voice grew sharper, his words more commanding. In secret, he began to speak of something greater than Pain's vision, a project centuries in the making. He told them of the Eye of the Moon plan, a dream to cast an infinite genjutsu across the entire world by using the power of the tailed beasts combined with the moon itself. In this dream, there would be no war, no hatred, no death. Every soul would live in peace, though it would be peace born of illusion. To most of the Akatsuki, these words seemed distant and abstract. Yet they listened, for Toby carried himself with knowledge that exceeded their understanding. Zetsu obeyed him without question, slipping in and out of the earth like a shadow. And in time, it became clear that Pain's godhood and Toby's quiet authority were on a collision course, for now they both claimed to serve the same purpose, the collection of the beasts, but their visions for the end differed in ways unseen. The Akatsuki's rise also forced the great nations to move in ways they had long resisted. Temporary alliances began to form, hesitant and fragile, yet bound by necessity. The threat of the Akatsuki was greater than the grudges of the past. For the first time in decades, shinobi of different lands began to whisper of fighting together, not against one another. The Akatsuki, once born from the dream of unity, had become the catalyst for true cooperation, though only to resist the storm they themselves had created. Still, not all who carried cloaks of red clouds were destined to see the plan through. Sasori, master of puppets, met his end against his own village's rising talents. Deidara, despite his pride, would one day push himself to a final explosion when faced with an opponent who refused to acknowledge his art. And Itachi, whose heart was never truly aligned with the Akatsuki, lived with secrets so heavy they shaped every step he took. The Akatsuki were powerful, but even among themselves, time was unraveling threads of fate. And yet, the ceiling continued. The statue loomed larger with each beast absorbed, its hollow eyes glowing faintly with captured power. Nagato believed the end was nearing, that the day would come when the nations bowed before him. But with each ritual, his frail body weakened further, and Konan's watchful eyes filled with quiet worry. She never voiced her doubts, never spoke of her fear for the boy she had once saved, the boy Yahiko had loved. Instead, she folded her paper wings around him and stayed by his side, unwavering. The Akatsuki were close now. With each victory, the world shifted closer to their vision of control. Nations trembled, heroes rose to resist, but still the red clouds moved across the skies, always advancing, always hunting. What began as a dream had become a nightmare the world could not escape. And in the shadows behind Pain's godhood, Toby's plan unfolded quietly, patiently, waiting for the day when his truth would eclipse even Nagato's vision. The Akatsuki's shadow stretched longer with each passing season, and though nations scrambled to resist, their efforts often arrived too late. Villages fortified their defenses. Alliances flickered into existence, yet nothing seemed to slow the relentless march of the red clouds. Still, among the members themselves, the slow erosion of unity had already begun. What had started as a shared mission grew fractured by losses, betrayals, and the weight of hidden motives. Sasori's death marked the first great crack. The puppet master, who had prided himself on eternity, was undone by a final act of humanity, struck down by Sakura Haruno and his old comrade, Chiyo. His fall was not just a blow to the Akatsuki's strength, but to their myth of invincibility. Enemies learned that even these monsters could bleed. For Deidara, the loss of his partner was personal, though he cloaked it in laughter and louder proclamations about the supremacy of his art. He continued forward, his explosions growing more violent, his need for recognition more desperate. Deidara's obsession reached its peak when he confronted Uchiha Sasuke. To him, Sasuke embodied everything he despised. A perfect, enduring beauty born of the Sharingan, mocking the fleeting artistry of Deidara's creations. Their battle shook the earth, each attack a clash of philosophy as much as power. But when Sasuke endured Deidara's strongest explosions, the artist made his final statement, choosing to end his life in one ultimate blast. His body was gone, but his laughter lingered in memory, the sound of a man who died for his vision of art. Another cloud had vanished from the Akatsuki's sky, leaving their formation thinner, their shadows less solid than before. Itachi, too, was nearing the end of his path. For years he had walked silently beside Kisame, his presence a steady reminder of calm terror. Yet behind his stoic face lay a heart burdened by sickness and secrets. His true loyalty had never belonged to the Akatsuki, but to Konoha itself, his crimes carried out not for ambition, but to prevent greater bloodshed. When his final battle came, it was not against the enemies of the Akatsuki, but against his own brother. In that fateful clash, Itachi gave Sasuke the truth in fragments and passed down the tools needed to one day face the darker forces looming over the shinobi world. His death was a quiet fracture in the Akatsuki's foundation, the loss of one of their most enigmatic and powerful members. Meanwhile, pain moved to the forefront of the world stage. For years, he had remained in the shadows, sending others to carry out the work of capturing the beasts. But now, the time had come for him to reveal the godhood he had claimed. His 6 paths descended upon Konoha, not simply to capture the Nine Tails, but to make a statement. His attack was more than a mission. It was a sermon delivered through devastation. With the force of almighty push, he reduced the Leaf Village to rubble, erasing generations of history in an instant. The survivors of Konoha fought valiantly, their resistance fierce but fragile against his overwhelming power. One by one, heroes fell or were pushed to their limits. Kakashi, the copy ninja, stood against him, his strength tested beyond measure. Hinata stepped forward in defiance, confessing her heart to Naruto as she fought desperately to shield him. The people of the Leaf saw their world collapse, their lives turned to dust under the weight of Pain's vision. To him, their suffering was justice. To them, it was tragedy. But in that devastation, Naruto rose. The boy who had once been scorned as a Jinchuriki now stood as the last defense of his village. His battle against Pain was more than strength against strength. It was the clash of ideologies born from similar wounds. Pain sought peace through control, through shared agony. Naruto, shaped by loneliness and the bonds he had forged, sought peace through understanding, through connection. Their fight stretched across the ruins of the village, the god and the child of prophecy, each carrying the legacy of their teachers. At last, Naruto broke through not by force, but by words. He listened to Nagato's pain, his losses, his shattered dream. he stood before the man who had declared himself a god and reminded him that he was still human, still a boy, once named Nagato, who had dreamed of peace alongside Yahiko and Konan. And in that moment, the weight of years fell upon Nagato's shoulders. The godhood he had claimed crumbled, leaving only a man too tired to carry on. His final act was not destruction, but redemption. He gave his life to restore the village he had erased, entrusting his dream to Naruto's hands. The death of Pain marked the true beginning of the Akatsuki's unraveling. Without Nagato's power and Konan's loyalty, their unity faltered. Konan, heartbroken yet resolute, turned her back on the organization, choosing to honor Yahiko's and Nagato's dream in her own way. The figure who stepped forward to fill the void was Toby. No longer the fool, no longer the comic relief, he revealed the truth of his identity, declaring himself Uchiha Madara. Whether he was truly Madara or merely wearing his name, the effect was the same. His words carried authority. His plan stretched far beyond what Nagato had envisioned, and the remaining Akatsuki members began to realize they were pawns in something much larger. The Akatsuki that had once been united under Yahiko's banner of peace had transformed entirely. What remained was no longer a group of misfit dreamers seeking justice, but the instrument of a grand design, one that sought not just the tailed beasts, but the entire world itself. In the quiet that followed the great battles of the Fourth Shinobi World War, the legacy of the Akatsuki lingered like a shadow that stretched across the land. Though the organization itself was gone, defeated, and broken apart by the combined efforts of the shinobi world, its influence remained undeniable. The story of the Akatsuki was not merely the tale of villains who sought destruction. It was the story of dreamers whose ideals had curdled into nightmares, of men and women who were scarred by a world that had offered them no peace, and of the terrible lengths they went to in their search for meaning. And as we reach the final stretch of their tale, it is important to pause and reflect on the weight of everything they represented. For the Akatsuki were not just a group of criminals. They were the echoes of a world in pain. When Nagato fell, his final act of resurrection brought a kind of redemption to his life. He had spent years enslaved by anger and despair, convinced that true peace could only come through overwhelming force. Yet in the final moment, inspired by Naruto's words and determination, he remembered what it was like to believe in hope. It was a small act of light in a long history of darkness, but it was enough to plant the seed of a new possibility. Konan, his ever-loyal companion, carried his memory forward, trying in her quiet way to honor the dream they had once shared. For her, the Akatsuki was never just about power. It had been about peace. She fought for that vision until her last breath, even as Obito pursued his own twisted version of the dream. Obito, who had manipulated the Akatsuki from the shadows, would bring the organization into its final chapter. Under the mask of Madara, he turned their goals toward the Moon's Eye plan, a scheme that would use the power of the 10 tails to cast an illusion over the entire world. In his mind, this was the only way to end suffering forever. A world of dreams, free from pain, free from loss, free from betrayal. But as grand as this idea was, it was still born from the same wound that had created the Akatsuki in the first place, the inability to accept the harshness of reality. Obito had lost Rin, and in losing her, he had lost his reason to keep living. Everything that followed was an attempt to fill that void, to force the world into a shape that would no longer hurt him. And through the Akatsuki, he nearly succeeded. The shinobi world watched in horror as the Akatsuki escalated their plans. They had already captured most of the tailed beasts, leaving a devastation in their wake. Villages were destroyed, lives were lost, and fear spread across the nations. The Shinobi Alliance formed in response, uniting former enemies under one banner for the first time in history. In this strange way, the Akatsuki accomplished something no one else had been able to do. They forced humanity to put aside its divisions and fight together. The irony was sharp. The very group that had preached about uniting the world through fear and pain ended up inspiring unity through resistance against their threat. As the Fourth War reached its peak, the Akatsuki, as an organization, no longer resembled the original band of rogue ninja that Nagato had once led. It had become a vessel for Obito's ambitions, and then for Madara's resurrection, and finally, for the plan of Kaguya herself. The cycle of manipulation never seemed to end, each leader using the Akatsuki's name to push their own designs forward. And yet, at the heart of it all, the Akatsuki's original truth still whispered. The world was filled with suffering, and no one had found an answer. Their mistakes, their crimes, their wars, all of it was the result of a world that had failed to heal. In the aftermath of the war, when Naruto and Sasuke finally brought an end to the chaos, the Akatsuki was no more. Their rings lay scattered, their cloaks abandoned, their names remembered only in whispers and history books. But the stories of those who wore the clouds on their backs lived on. Kisame, who fought to the end with loyalty to a dream larger than himself. Deidara, who sought beauty in explosions. An artist whose canvas was the battlefield. Sasori, who turned his own body into a puppet to escape the vulnerabilities of flesh, only to be defeated by the humanity he had tried to abandon. Haiden, immortal, but cursed to a cycle of blood and emptiness. Kakuzu, bound to money and stitched together by greed. Each one had lived a life shaped by pain, and each one found in the Akatsuki a place where their brokenness felt less alone. The Akatsuki's red clouds remain their most enduring symbol. To some, those clouds were a warning, a reminder of destruction and war. But to those who knew their origin, the clouds were something else, They were the blood-stained rain that had once fallen on the land of rain, a land forgotten by the great powers, a land where children cried out for peace, and no one came. That symbol carried the weight of Nagato's sorrow, Yahiko's sacrifice, and Conan's faith. It was a symbol of loss, but also of longing, a reminder that behind every act of cruelty, there was once a wound left unhealed. And so, when we speak of the Akatsuki, it is not enough to call them villains. They were a mirror held up to the shinobi world, reflecting its failures, its injustices, and its inability to break the cycle of hatred. They were the children of war, grown into weapons of war, and in their tragic arcs, they revealed the cost of a system that thrived on conflict. The Akatsuki forced the world to face itself, and in doing so, they became one of the most unforgettable chapters in its history. Now, as you drift into sleep, imagine those black cloaks with their red clouds billowing in the wind. Imagine the long procession of figures walking through rain and shadows, each carrying their burdens, each chasing their visions. They are gone now, their story told, their era ended. But the memory of the Akatsuki lingers, like a lullaby in the storm. And perhaps, in the quiet of your dreams, you can find a gentler version of their wish, the hope for a world where children no longer need to wear clouds of blood to be seen,